this very special one between NOMA and Columbia University's Zuckerman Institute. We are thrilled to bring to you tonight our 6th installment of our performance and dialogue series that fascinatingly explores the intersections between jazz, music, and science. Tonight's program, The Social Brain and Music, once again promises to be another exciting and illuminating one, and one that will most certainly generate questions and comments. And so we invite you to engage with us this evening, to make comments, to ask questions, which you can put in the chat, and we will be sure to give you a chance to ask them of our experts. So we are going to get started. And as I've said, every time we have this program, I love this series. It's such a joy working with the remarkable Miguel Zenón and meeting and hearing from the fascinating scientists who join him during this program. It's also a special joy to work with the wonderful Dr. Paula Cruxon, neuroscientist and Associate Director for Public Programs at Columbia University's Zuckerman Institute, who I introduce to you now, and who will tell us a bit more about the program and introduce our evening's featured experts. Paula.
Hi, everybody, and welcome. It's so wonderful to be here on a Monday night with you all. I'm so delighted that we have the opportunity to mix the arts and science in this way. We're lucky enough to have Miguel Zenón as our jazz artist in residence at the Zuckerman Institute, which means he spends time around the Institute getting to know the scientists, and I get the privilege of working with him to create events like this that find new ways to bring science into the world. I feel like science is everywhere, it's all around us, and this is just another opportunity for us to figure out the ways in which that is the case. I think Miguel probably needs no introduction, but he is rather marvelous. He is multi-Grammy nominee, and he is a Guggenheim and MacArthur fellow, and he is an incredible player, and he will be playing for us tonight. And also, it's my great pleasure to introduce our scientist for this evening. And this evening's scientist is Jennifer Scribner. And I'll let her tell you more about her background than I possibly could, but just as a little teaser, she's both a neuroscientist and a percussionist. And she's had many jobs and many roles in her life, including as both of those things. She's currently a graduate student research scientist in the lab of Dr. Richard Axel, who's one of our Nobel Prize winners at the Institute. And I think I'm going to hand it straight over to you, Miguel. So welcome.
Thank you, Paula, and welcome all. It's so great to get to do this again. Thank you to our wonderful team at NOMA for again welcoming us into their house here, a virtual household, and giving us the space to share this with all of you. As always, exciting, and I'm very excited about tonight as well. As we usually do, I'm going to start us off with some music just to kind of get things kind of warmed up and relaxed a little bit. So I'm going to play a song. This is an old song. I think it's like was originally written in the mid-'30s, but it's become sort of like a standard within the jazz repertoire, and it's called "I'm in the Mood for Love." I'm going to play this. All right, I'm in the mood for love. So very, very happy to have Jennifer here with us. Jennifer and I, we've been interacting pretty much since the beginning of the residency. We've never actually met, like face to face, but we've interacted a bunch, putting together different events. So very, very excited to have you here, Jennifer. So the first thing I wanted to ask you, I know Paula brought this up already. You have a musical background, which is is the case with a lot of our guests, which is kind of nice, But I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about like your musical background, just to get us started.
Yeah, sure. And thank you for the song choice, because it's also a great segue into my research interests. And this idea that so many of my social bonds have really come through my shared musical and science experiences. So my music background, I grew up in the Catskill Mountains on a farm near the town of Woodstock, New York, which is rich musical history there. And I was very fortunate. I started playing the drums in elementary school. And so I have to give a huge shout out to music educators. That was so important in my early days, and I fell in love with it. My parents were hugely supportive, even though they weren't musicians at all. So then, I kept going with that. I had played in all the different ensembles. I did every form of music, whether it was jazz ensemble, orchestra, concert band, marching band. And these were just really major social connections for me. And then in college, I studied neuroscience. But again, most of my time was spent, I think I performed in just about every music ensemble on campus at the time.
So you were still making music while you were in college? You were still playing, actively playing?
Yeah, I actually became more active in college in a way because just the vast opportunities to experience different musics. So it's interesting. In high school, I was really more of a jazz player, and that was my main focus, playing with some friends who are still active musicians today. And then in college, I really transitioned, and again, it had to do with my social connections. into playing orchestral music and contemporary new music by new composers. So that really kept me active. And I started playing professionally in college at the time, playing with New Haven Symphony and orchestras in Connecticut and various theater gigs as well.
And you know, one thing that during our previous conversation, you were talking about how music, you know, this idea of your early connection to music kind of tied like directly to your research or what you're doing now, or to you becoming a scientist, I would say, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I always was interested in social bonds for a research point of view. And when I think of social bonds, I often think of them in terms of learning and memory. And so how does the brain, you know, represent like things that we're experiencing about people, and how does it translate into internal representations that ultimately drive behavior? And it's like this very abstract process, and it's a challenge in neuroscience to go from you know, the things we experience about someone, how they look, how they smell, that happens to be an area that I'm interested in, and then how it generates behavior, how these representations in our brain get meaning and generate behaviors.
And why don't you tell us a little more in detail about the work you're doing these days?
Sure. So my research question is very much interested in how social bonds are formed and remembered. And the challenge, as I mentioned, in neuroscience is, how do you actually address these questions? And so I alluded to this, but one way we can think about the brain and try to understand it is in terms of the ways we experience various sensory stimuli. So things that we hear, things that we see, and things that we smell. And our brain takes these things and really kind of absolutely abstracts them. And when we talk about an internal representation of these things in our brain, it's these patterns of electrical and chemical activity. And then the challenge is, how do we get there from there to actual behaviors? And we generally think of, to simplify things, which we often have to do in neuroscience, we tend to group things into innate behaviors. So cues that just have an innate meaning to us and drive an instinctual response. And so those are things, a good example might be like a mother responding to a crying baby.
Right.
And then there are other behaviors where we only learn about them through association, and these behaviors only emerge once we learn. So in the lab, to study social bonds and the learning and behaviors that happen around social bonds, we have to turn to model organisms because we can't go about poking the brains of humans. I mean, people do that research, and it's fantastic, and we have a lot more access now to do research in humans. But some of the questions that I'm interested in, where you get down to the level of the cells that are communicating to each other, you have to bring it down into organisms that you have some control over genetically and behaviorally. And so we happen to know quite a bit about the mouse and its genetics, but we also know a lot about social behaviors. So the particular social behavior that I'm interested in that actually gives us this great opportunity to explore both innate and learned behaviors is the question of, how does a female mouse find and attract a suitable partner? So that goes back to
of course,
your opening.
I'm in the mood for love. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the female mouse is looking for love, and mice, for their communication, they use scent marks. They also use ultrasonic vocalizations, which is their form of singing, but a lot of it is done through scent marking. And there happens to be this pheromone that's present in the scent mark of a male, and it's called darsin. And notably, it's named after the character, the romantic character, Mr. Darcy, in
Right.
Jane Austen's novel, Pride and Prejudice. And so you can imagine where I'm going there.
Right.
This pheromone is innately attractive to the female mice. So she experiences, she's like, this is the one.
This is the guy.
And this is the guy. And the pheromone motivates her to explore the area and the smells that are associated with Darcy. And the pheromone also elicits learning, and that's unusual for a pheromone because we usually associate pheromones with innate behaviors, not learning. But this pheromone happens to generate learning, and we speculate that this helps the female remember all the cues that are associated with this male so that she can find him later and signal to him to say, hey, I think you're the one for me, to grossly anthropomorphize the whole situation. So yeah, when us behaviorists, behavioral neuroscientists tend to like try to put ourselves in the head of mice, and that gets a little dicey, certainly, but it helps inspire our research. And that's where I get to the research of my friend and collaborator, Dr. Ebru Demir, and she used genetic techniques to find a very specific population of neurons in this brain region called the amygdala, which is associated with emotional behavior, but a whole bunch of different responses. And she found that activity in these cells is responsible for both the innate responses, so this immediate attraction to Darcy, but also the learning. So without the activity in these neurons, you don't learn to about the place or the smells that are associated. But we have an open question, because once they've learned, these cells aren't needed for the memory anymore. And that's where my research is picking up. And that's the project that I'm starting out exploring for my graduate thesis work, about looking at where the memory is stored. And we have some ideas, but I still have to do the experiments to ask what set of cells or what brain region, how do these things come together and get stored as a memory, so that the behaviors of like singing out to the male and counter scent marking, because the female does all these behaviors to try to signal back to the male. So
that's so cool. That's so cool.
Yeah.
So Jen, I was going to ask, I mean, we also talked about this before, but how do we translate this to us, human beings, relationships, social cues? I know you had some really interesting personal stories about connecting music to an experience or to a relationship, meeting someone.
Yeah. So, I mean, I have a number of experiences growing up in high school, but, as far as like a very personal social bond, I, was out and about socially and not dating anyone, and happened to meet the person who is now my future husband at a party, and we got talking about jazz. And, I'll couch this by like, I don't think I ever dated anyone who wasn't a musician or an artist. So I mean, I'm certainly biased here. So my social connections are very influenced by music and art. So our first date was going to a McCoy Tyner and Bobby Hutcherson concert. And that's resonated, and we're still together now. Almost 13 years later.
Wow.
Actually, it's more than that. We're married 13 years. That's like 16 years later. So those initial, experiences that, the sensory experience of experiencing this music really sealed it in for me, and presumably for him as well, to make this social connection.
I would love to play a clip of what that sounded like. I think this was probably like 2003, 2004, maybe, Jen.
Yeah,
about this.
That's about right.
So around this time, Bobby Hutcherson, the great vibraphonist, and McCoy Tyner, the legendary pianist who worked with John Coltrane and many other figures, they made an album together called Manhattan Moves. So I'm going to play a clip from this album just so we get into the mindset of what Jennifer experienced around this time. We can all hear what that sounded like. Let's check that out. I'm kind of jealous now that you got to see them play together. So one thing I wanted to do really quick while we talk a little more, because one thing that's really great about this that you're talking about, obviously this idea about social cues and social connection through music and experiences, and obviously you listen. I mean, it's hard for you to listen to this track and not think about this experience, right? Or even think about this person. That's really what it is, what this means to you. And we all have things like that. We have a piece of music or even a movie, or like we might think about a place, but in this case, when you think about a piece of music that reminds you of a person, of a relationship you have or had, it could be a partner, it could be a family member or a friend. So I was wondering, we have some friends here, if folks feel inclined to put maybe in a chat and share with us an experience, specifically a track, a piece of music that connects you to someone else. I would love to hear, we would love to hear a little bit of that, a lot of that feedback, because we all have that. We all have that. For me, there's a song by the Beatles that I always think about when I think about my wife. It's like a similar thing. We all have something like that. But I think it'll be interesting to see and to hear what folks have to say. Any takers out there? Anyone wants to put something in the chat? Let me see. Come on, guys and gals. Give me something. Any takers?
In the meantime, I have to say I really like Paula's comment, whether this is the equivalent of the musical equivalent of the pheromone Darson. And in a way, it kind of is. It helps you make an association. And Darson promotes learning. So I think, Paula, you're spot on there.
That's very interesting. So we got Sade from Neria, Joni Mitchell, Blue. That's a great album from Daniel. Paula saying her mom used to play Debussy on the piano for hours. Of course, that's hard to avoid. All Green, wow, brings my mom to mind from Margaret. My Funny Valentine, Federico, Bill Evans and Jim Hall. Yeah, all so great, music. It's amazing how this goes. Another thing I was thinking about, kind of along the same lines, and we were having this conversation too, Jen, was not only this idea of music being sort of like the link to a social experience or a social connection, but also finding a link in a piece of music, finding a link to something else, right? Like you might be hearing a piece of music, and then within that piece of music, there's a reference to another piece of music that might have nothing to do with it, but then immediately that kind of transports you to this other experience, right? It's like an experience within an experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a device that composers, in my experience working with the American Composers Orchestra and having friends who are composers, certainly use that technique to bring in, and I refer to composers in all styles of music, and also performers in many styles of music, bringing in things that they've experienced or the background and it helps anchor or form another set of connections. So it's a really fabulous thing.
That's interesting. There was an example that you brought up that I wanted to share from this composition by Igor Stravinsky, called Les Noces. How do you say that in French?
It's Les Noces.
Les Noces, right.
The wedding. So it
the wedding,
again,
the wedding.
Goes along with social bonds very interestingly. And to set a little context here, I first experienced Les Noces in college and in those days, performing it with some friends. And then it was a wonderful experience learning this music. And then later on, when I was associated with the American Composers Orchestra, I think that's when I learned more of the history of the piece and what Stravinsky had excerpted from or drawn from these really fascinating references to Russian folk singing and folk wedding melodies.
Yes.
And so I'm experiencing it from multiple points of view of like having the social connections around performing this music, but then also this device that composers and musicians use to ground something, to form a connection with somebody based on their reference points, social reference points.
Yeah, and one of the things that I wanted to bring up before we play the clip is that many of these composers, I mean, definitely Stravinsky, but also Bartók, and a lot of other composers like Ligeti, or 20th century composers, they were deeply embedded in folklore. I'm very interested in the idea of bringing this folksy sounds into a chamber type of musical environment, and this is one of those instances where this becomes kind of obvious because of the what we hear and the vocal aspect of it. So this is one excerpt. Was this the third tableau, the fourth tableau?
The fourth tableau.
The fourth tableau, which is like one of the sections of the piece, and then we're gonna kind of put that together with something from this amazing ensemble that I didn't know, but Jen kind of brought this up. It's a Russian vocal ensemble, right? Pokrovsky Ensemble. And they made an album kind of with Les Noces kind of like interlaced with some traditional kind of Russian songs. And I think what was the name of this piece? The song that we were gonna put it together with?
It's Play Smetanich, or I'm mangling the pronunciation,
right.
but that's the.
So Play is a choral piece, and this is the fourth tableau from Stravinsky, Les Noces. So we're gonna listen to this real quick just to kind of hear both references back to back. So the first one was a Stravinsky. The second one was the traditional piece. Obviously, what's interesting about that to me is that, I mean, musically it's pretty obvious. You can make the connection, even rhythmically, melodically. The beginning of the second piece was very similar to the Stravinsky. But what's interesting to me is how those kind of worlds, which seem really far apart, kind of come together musically, but also depending on who's listening. Like for you, there's a very specific, like a personal kind of social connection about you playing this piece, right? And kind of like getting to experience it as a musician, but also getting to hear it in the context of his other piece and putting the two together in your head.
Yeah, absolutely. And it certainly, you know, throughout my music career, I really enjoyed experiencing, you know, how composers work and how musicians work when I was no longer working as a musician. And, you know, it was really inspiring to see how, you know, they would integrate these pieces into their work.
Yeah, that's so cool. I want to actually share something from my side because we were talking about this and I got super excited. So so one of my favorite musicians, probably my favorite of all time, is Charlie Parker, the saxophonist. And Charlie Parker is sort of known for this idea of musical quotations. You know, I mean, many musicians are, but he was kind of a master of this in terms of embedding his solos with this quotations that could come from anywhere, from cartoons to popular song to like chamber music, right? And I mean that not only talks about his own genius, but about the fact that all this music could kind of come together in one place. For me personally, when I hear this, it's really amazing to you know, to a lot of times what happens is this, you know, like I'll hear a solo and he'll quote something that I might know or not. And if I know it, I immediately go, oh, that's this piece, or that's from this show, from this movie, or that's this cartoon. But sometimes I don't know it, but I know he's quoting something, right? I know that's from somewhere that I don't know. So immediately I'm going, okay, and then somewhere, like let's say 3 years from now, I'm gonna hear that piece, and immediately it's gonna bring me back to that Charlie Parker solo. So it's like the connection is like kind of like both ways for me, you know? So I did this. I spent a little time because I got really excited. I spent a little time doing this, kind of like with the help of like of some people that have a lot more time than I do, to kind of like put this information together. And I put this little compilation of Charlie Parker quotations, all connected to classical music, right?
Wow.
So like I think you're gonna hear something. I think let me kind of think back. There's something like a Chopin etude. There's a couple of Stravinsky pieces. Like one, I think one's Petrushka, one is Rite of Springs. There's some like a Wagner Tannhauser from the opera. There's a Carmen. So it's like all over the place, and he's doing this in the middle of his solos. So like it tells you so much about his genius, but also like I said, it's like it merely takes you to this other place that seems so far away, but he's putting them together in the same place. So let me share this because I'm actually kind of excited about sharing this. This is Charlie Parker quotes. So that's kind of fun, right? I mean, just like
Wow.
thinking about all those things coming together and hearing them back to back. But for me, like some of those pieces, of course, are very, very well known, like the Blue Danube and like this Carmen piece. But some of them are a little more obscure. So you're like, wow, where is that from? But he's doing something there. So it's almost like he's sending you this mystery song. And once you hear it, like for me, the experience is like coming back to the solo. Wow, I got to go back and find that one CD that I had and put the two together. So it's like the whole thing for me is such a it's a really trippy experience,
That was absolutely amazing. And for me too, since I am interested in so many types of music and have performed a lot of different types of music, hearing those juxtapositions that you put together, it's just really astounding. And it's astounding. It brings up so many connections. It multiplies the connections and associations that I form because I have all these vast connections with playing, especially a lot of Stravinsky in college and stuff. But then to Charlie Parker, we were talking about some Charlie Parker stuff when I was in a trio with a dear high school friend, Deborah Kreisberg, and Julian Coriel. So we were sax, bass, and drums. And, we almost all the time, like our first tune, like warming up when we were playing in my upstairs bedroom at home, was Now's the Time by Charlie Parker. And, that was, a significant memory. And I can't hear that tune or also Take Five, another tune.
Right.
Paul Desmond and Dave Brubeck, that I can't hear those tunes without going back to those high school associations of really fond memories playing with that trio. So it's just fascinating how these things can then interweave and create even more layers of social connections.
Yeah,
And
most definitely.
when it gets to that point, it becomes really hard to study from a neuroscience point of view. We often have to really simplify things down to be able to study it at the level of how our neurons in our brain are doing anything. So
yeah. So another thing we talked about, Jen, before we open it up to some questions, is especially during this time, for us musicians, it's been a difficult time, not only because we haven't been able to work as we usually do, but there's this idea of music as something that you do, as a social activity, something you do with other people and for others, right? When you perform, when you play music, you're usually playing with your colleagues, right? You play with a group of friends or a group of colleagues, and you're creating something together. I mean, you could even say if you're playing by yourself, and a lot of times you're trying to create this social thing where like you either like thinking about a secondary voice or just some counterpoint, always like this conversation, right? And that's something that hasn't been happening around this time. It's been very difficult for a lot of musicians and artists who are used to having this activity and playing with others to like being reduced to the idea of playing at a distance. Or I mean, now it's starting to get a little more opened up, but it's been difficult for a while. And there's also this idea which I brought up on one of our conversations too, is the idea of how important it is to share your music with someone who's there. Like sharing your music with someone who's in the room. I mean, as great as it is, I mean, playing for all of you who are at home, being comfortable at home, I'd rather have you in the room with me, because even if you were sitting there, and I also said this last time, it's like, even if you were just sitting there in silence, not clapping or doing anything, it's going to make me play different. It's going to make me react to the situation different because it's not just me, right? I'm reacting to someone else who, even like me, like unconsciously, I'm thinking someone is right there listening to me play. So I'm going to play differently. I was wondering if you could talk about that. Both, I mean, I know your experience as a musician, but you could talk about that a little bit from the science point of view.
Sure, I can try. It's a challenging thing because there's probably many explanations for why music, when we experience it in a group situation, is much more meaningful to us. And
Mhm.
I'll add that I think it affects science too, because I'm certainly finding it's harder to be creative scientifically if I'm not
Right.
bouncing ideas off my lab mates. And so in an attempt to simplify this and generate some idea of what might be going on, and this is, and I'll couch this is complete oversimplification and very simplified, but just getting back to the sensory stimuli that we experience when we're not in the room with somebody performing music or doing our science. There's a lot of sensory inputs that we're missing.
Yeah.
And there's happens to be one very well-known pro-social neuropeptide hormone that's called oxytocin. You may have heard of it. It's, in the popular literature, it's like, it's the love drug and stuff like that. But there's actually real serious scientific research about the role of oxytocin and how we process social sensory cues, both in humans, where the research is at a broader level, but it's also been done in animals. So, I've done studies that weren't specifically looking at oxytocin, but looking at pair bonding behaviors in certain species of prairie voles. And the voles, they don't form social bonds if oxytocin isn't present. We also know that oxytocin influences activity in the auditory cortex. So that might be directly related to music. And we know that from research that was actually done by a current new professor at the Zuckerman Institute, Dr. Bianca Jones-Marlin, who found in her graduate work that oxytocin release in the auditory cortex is what helps stimulate maternal behaviors in caring for pups. Wow. And then there's a whole bunch of studies looking at how oxytocin release in the olfactory cortex, which is the region of the brain that I'm most interested in, is critical for social recognition. So if I'm going to make a leap, a very speculative leap, people have shown in humans that oxytocin release is induced by music experiences. And we know it is certainly involved in pro-social behavior and reduction of anxiety, and it heightens our awareness and the signal to noise of all these sensory inputs. So I think a good research question to explore, I don't think we have the answer, might be the effects of the lack of input, so lack of oxytocin release that might be impacting our social relationships or social connections through music and science. But I'll state this is very speculative, and someone who studies oxytocin more directly would probably have to think very carefully about how to design the research question that really gets at the question. That turns out it might be involved in my research, but I'm not ready to go there yet.
That's very cool. Before we go on and maybe open it up for some questions, maybe this could be a first comment or question. This is from Cyrus Buchanan, a good friend. He says, I would also say in medicine, physicians are also increasingly isolated and making diagnosis management plans in isolation when previously more collaborative work was possible, that now telehealth and remote distancing working eliminates. It's very distressing and harms the work and care and joy at levels we have yet to understand. Collaboration and jamming together enhances all work and flow states. Really agree. Thank you, Cito. Thank you, Cyrus, for sharing. We're going to open it up for some questions or comments from anyone. Anyone has anything to add? Any questions? Any comments, criticisms, questions? Feel free to put them in the chat if you feel like it. Yes, no.
Well, I always hesitate to be the one to ask all the questions, but while we're waiting for some of you to be brave enough. So I'm curious from both a science perspective and from the perspective of musicians, what can we do to keep our oxytocin flowing during these times? What is effective in terms of forming these social connections even while we're apart?
Well, I would say from a musical perspective, was really I mean, I would say it's interesting about the times that we're living now that you're kind of having to reinvent the way you connect with someone else musically. You know, I mean, I've had all kinds of interactions over Zoom and other, you know, other platforms, and there's some you know, there's some softwares out some pieces of software out there that can actually enable you to play in real time. You know, I've done concerts in real time. I'm here and my friend is in Brooklyn or whatever, and we're playing in real time, making music together, and people are watching, and you know, like that, I think that's as close as you can get, of course, because you're playing music at the same time. It's not something that's pre-recorded or overdubbed, which is that's the thing that's most common these days. Um, but you know, I think it's been hard for me to still get it to a place where it feels the same. You know, I think it's there are some things that you can get close, like something like this, but there's some things that are just kind of irreplaceable. And I feel there are certain things about the connection, this like having someone in the room or just like playing for an audience that's there. You can kind of get close from my perspective, but it's hard to replace, you know. So I would say the way to get back to those levels is just to get, you know, get healthy and get out there playing again. That's for me, that's really where it is.
Yeah, I would have to agree. And you know, certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, I really struggled with being motivated to do anything. It was such scary times. And you know, for me, the interesting thing is when I got back to neuroscience is when I actually got back to playing music. I had been on a long pause from playing and really making the connections with a number of people. My PI is a huge lover of opera. Mike Shadlin, who's been on this program a number of times, he and I started playing jazz together, so I made all these connections. A postdoc introduced me to performing with the Greenwich Village Orchestra. So finally, once again, I was back at playing. And then the pandemic happened. And my research was shut down, my music got shut down, and I really shut down for a long period of time. It took me a while to emerge. And I think for me, the good sign now is starting to get back out there, you know, getting vaccinated, getting healthy, staying healthy. And the good sign is like, I've started practicing again. It's not yet at the time that I can play with people because I haven't explored you know, the various technologies because I'm not a professional musician and don't have the need to really do that. But that's my sign of hope that I'm back at the music now, as well as trying to get my experiments back up and running. So, you know, I think the comment that we have a long way to go to understand like the long range impacts of this pandemic, I think that's very true. I think those will be questions for scientists and musicians and social psychologists and doctors to think about for quite some time, and how we address things, because there's a lot to deal with.
Yeah.
We have sorry, Miguel.
Go ahead, Miriam. Go ahead.
I was going to say we have a question from Daniel, who's here. Daniel, would you like to ask your question? You can unmute. Are you there, Daniel? Okay, so I'll ask the question. What is the difference between melody and tone and rhythm from a neural perspective? For example, can you see different brain areas stimulated? It's a great question.
It is a great question. I think the answer is probably yes and no. I don't know if this is on purpose or not, but I've distinctly kept my music and neuroscience interests separate. So I am not very well versed in the neuroscience of music perception. But I do know that the auditory cortex is one of the primary spaces where we hear everything. So, rhythm has some tonality to it, even if it's broad spectrum. So it all starts in the auditory cortex. And then for the higher cognitive processing of distinguishing and understanding tones and rhythms, tones are represented in the auditory cortex in what's called a tonotopic fashion. So different tones are represented in different sets of grouped neurons. And then for rhythm, I actually haven't investigated that. I don't know if anyone else on the call, maybe Paula, if you have any more background in it. I'm embarrassed to say, like, they're both my passions, but I've distinctly kind of kept them separate from my research and study point of view.
Yeah, I'm also going to bungle the answer to this question because, yeah, there's a follow-up here. Is there a connection to motor cortex for rhythm? Yes, there is. Yeah, so it's definitely the case that when we listen to music, we activate the brain areas that we need to listen to music, like the auditory cortex, which really does process all of the different aspects of music. But we also tend to, especially if we're musicians ourselves, but even if we're not, even if we like to move to music, which is most of us, we activate also the brain areas that we might need to do those other things. So musicians, for example, have who read music habitually have really strong responses in their visual cortex when they listen to music. So people like me who are like taught to play classical music and read music, and then for most of us we have activity when we listen to music in our premotor cortex, which is the piece of cortex sits next to our motor cortex that primes and readies our motor cortex to go, almost as if we're ready to play along or to move along to the music. And then, of course, you probably are all familiar with that feeling of being really moved to move to the music, whether you like it or not. That's your brain getting ahead of you and making those connections. So definitely, great question.
Yeah, and as a percussionist, I have to say that connection is very strong. This is almost embarrassing to admit, but if I'm listening to music that I enjoy while eating, I can't help but chew in rhythm. I can't stop it. So I have to be very careful about what music I listen to when I'm eating, and it's kind of embarrassing, but it's a funny connection that really points out to, especially as a trained percussionist, I almost can't stop myself from reacting.
That's so cool, and that's a. I mean that example, not exactly the same example, but I've heard a lot of similar things, about kind of like syncing up to rhythm or syncing up to without realizing if you're walking and you're hearing a song or syncing up, and it's it's almost unavoidable, like you said. Well, I think. It's been great, Jen. It's time kind of flew. I was looking at the clock now. I was like, wow, we've been here for an hour already. Let me take us out with some music. I was thinking about what to play, and I played this sort of loft song from the Great American Songbook before. So I'm gonna go to the Latin American Songbook now, and play a really beautiful song by a Mexican composer. His name was Alvaro Carrillo. He wrote a lot of beautiful songs. And this one is called Sabor a mí. Sabor a mí. Let me play a little bit of this. All right. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Neria. Thank you, Noma. Thank you, Paula. Thank you all for joining us. We have another event next month. Is that right?
That's right, we do. And thank you for that. I just want to say, talk about being transported. My grandmother, when she was cooking, would whistle that song. And for some reason, I've never ever met someone who had a stronger whistle than and more powerful than my grandmother. And she would whistle, I'm smelling food. I'm thinking of my grandmother. I'm looking at my grandfather, looking at my grandfather. So thank you for that, because that was just beautiful. We do. We have another wonderful program on May 17th. We hope you will all join us then. We're looking forward to having you. We are thrilled. Thank you so much, Jennifer. It was really wonderful to have you here. I learned so much tonight. So fascinating a discussion. Miguel, as always, having you here is just such a joy, such an honor. And Paula, thank you so much for being here. I love working with you. It's really wonderful. Visit us at nomanyc.org for all of our programs, and be sure to join us again on May 17th. We look forward to it. Good night, everybody, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you all. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Good night.
Bye.